She called it a celebration, but it felt more like an invasion. I heard the crunch of tires on gravel long before I saw the convoy of expensive SUVs winding up the trail that led to my cabin. The HOA president sat in the front seat of the lead vehicle, oversized sunglasses hiding the contempt she barely bothered to conceal anymore. This wasn't a spontaneous event. No, this was a declaration. They wanted to make sure I knew exactly who held power in our so-called community, even if it meant coming all the way out here into what she'd once referred to as that filthy hermit shack on the edge of civilization. The thing about people like her. They think money and entitlement can cross every boundary, including the physical ones marked by private property, signs nailed to trees along my road. They saw those signs, all of them. She laughed when she passed the first one, raised her glass of champagne to it by the third, and by the time they stepped out of their polished, suburban, HOA-mandated black SUVs, she had decided my home was theirs for the evening. They weren't subtle either. Portable speakers, folding tables, crates of drinks, all unloaded by people who clearly didn't want to be there. A couple of the HOA board members looked uncomfortable already, like they'd been roped into this by guilt or fear or the usual HOA peer pressure that kept everyone in line. But the president? She was thriving. She strutted across the gravel driveway in high heels that were utterly impractical out here, declaring loudly that she was going to bring some class to this rustic hovel. I watched from the edge of the tree line, unseen for now, silent, calculating. They'd been pushing me for months, sending letters with invented violations, fines for things like grass height discrepancies, and non-standard mailbox design. Once, they fined me because a squirrel had chewed a hole in my compost bin before I could fix it. It wasn't about rules. It was about control. Control, and something uglier beneath it, something they dressed up in flowery HOA bylaws but couldn't quite hide. I wasn't like them. I didn't wear the right clothes. I didn't host barbecues. I didn't drive their brand of SUV. I didn't smile when they smiled. And perhaps most of all, I wasn't the right kind of neighbor for their aesthetic. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. The traps started simple. The first, of course, was the welcome mat. Not a hidden pit or some cartoon nonsense. Just a welcome mat, slightly frayed, placed at the entrance to my cabin. Underneath it, a carefully balanced sack of non-toxic, biodegradable glitter. When the first eager intruder stepped onto it, the entire front porch exploded in a cloud of shimmering, multicolored dust, coating her white blouse in sparkles from neck to hem. Laughter, some nervous, some genuine, followed by gasps of horror as they realized the glitter clung to everything. It was going to take weeks to get that out of their expensive clothes, their leather seats, their carefully curated social media aesthetic. "Oh my God, is that glitter?" someone shrieked. The HOA president smiled, wiping a few sparkles from her sunglasses. "It's fine. It's festive. Rustic chic, right?" They still didn't get it. They thought it was a prank. They didn't understand that this wasn't a joke. It was a line in the sand. It was the same way they laughed when I first moved into the neighborhood's outskirts, like some curiosity or pet oddity. They called me the hermit, as if they thought I couldn't hear. HOA fines were one thing, but the real pain had been watching them target others like me. Families who didn't fit their mold. Single moms, older couples on fixed incomes, immigrants who just wanted peace and quiet. Fines piled up until they sold their homes in desperation or disgust. And each time someone left, someone like the president would celebrate with a sparkling wine toast at one of their identikit backyard patios. But this was my turn now. And I wasn't leaving. A second glitter bomb popped as another of her friends leaned against the railing, sending a spray of green dust into the humid summer air. The laughter stopped. One of the younger women muttered something about her dress being ruined. The discomfort was starting to build, but pride is a powerful thing, and their leader wasn't about to back down over something so childish. "Don't mind the decorations," she said smugly. "I'm sure whoever lived here before thought it was charming. We're just updating it." Whoever lived here before. They thought they could erase me with paperwork, fines, and parties. But they didn't know what I'd been preparing. I remembered when they fined one of the local veterans for having a flagpole that didn't meet regulation height. I remembered how they mocked the elderly Pakistani couple who planted vegetables instead of ornamental grass. They'd gotten rid of them, all under the veil of community standards, and no one had been able to stop them. No one had fought back. Until now. It wasn't about vengeance, not really. It was about holding the line. About sending a clear, unmistakable signal. Not here. Not anymore. Another SUV door opened and out stepped the HOA president's husband, one of those men who spent more time on golf courses than anywhere meaningful, carrying a cooler full of imported beer. He didn't even notice the fishing line stretched between two posts. He tripped, stumbled, and spilled the entire cooler's contents onto his loafers. There were no smiles this time. Just anger. Embarrassment. That's when she barked my name into the trees. "I know you're out there," she said, voice sharp. "You can't stop us. You can't win. You're just one person." I stepped forward then. Not hiding anymore. Let them see the mud on my boots, the dirt on my jeans, the sweat on my forehead. Let them see the real difference between us. "You're right," I said quietly. "I am one person." She smirked, thinking that was a concession. But it wasn't. It was a promise. Because what she didn't know yet was that every step they took further into my home wasn't just walking onto my property, it was walking deeper into a war they didn't even understand. They thought this was about a party. They thought this was about HOA regulations. They thought this was about making a statement to scare me off. They were wrong. This was about territory. About belonging. About drawing a line where polite society forgot how to stop itself. And one thing they didn't teach in HOA bylaws was what happens when you try to take everything from someone with nothing left to lose. The first traps were just glitter. The real traps were yet to come. They thought it was funny at first. Glitter bombs, a tripped fishing line, a cooler full of imported beer soaking someone's overpriced leather shoes. It was all entertainment to them. Annoying, yes, but not threatening. They still saw themselves as winners here, as rightful conquerors turning my solitude into their playground. They laughed it off the way privileged people always do when they think the world belongs to them. What they didn't realize was that the humor was the first layer of the trap. People like them always missed the warnings disguised as joke. I didn't bother hiding anymore. I wanted them to see me standing at the edge of the treeline. They needed to know who was doing this to them. It wasn't anonymous mischief. It was deliberate, personal. The HOA president locked eyes with me across the yard, something sharp flashing behind her practiced smile. She could smile all she wanted. I'd seen that expression before, years back, watching bureaucrats dress malice in pleasantries. HOA meetings, town councils, always the same faces pushing out the undesirables, all while sipping coffee and talking about community improvement like they were doing you a favor. They called me antisocial. They didn't know I used to organize local food drives, or how I'd been the first to mow an elderly neighbor's lawn before anyone asked. None of that mattered to them. I didn't fit the picture they wanted. Now I wasn't just an inconvenience, I was in their way. One of her friends made the mistake of stepping around the front of the cabin, ignoring the narrow path I'd worn into the dirt from years of routine. That path existed for a reason. Every other part of this clearing was a minefield of carefully placed, harmless but humiliating surprises. He didn't know that until his foot came down on what looked like a harmless mound of leaves. Underneath, a pressure plate I'd rigged to a system of overhead bucket. Not paint. Not acid. Flour. A whole storm of it. The man stumbled back into view coughing and swearing, covered head to toe in flour, looking like a ghost in a polo shirt. This time, the laughter came out strained, forced. It was starting to dawn on them that they weren't the ones in control of this scene. The HOA president tried to recover. "All right, enough of this childishness," she called, adjusting her expensive necklace as though that would restore order. "We're here to enjoy ourselves, and some antisocial freak isn't going to ruin it. I raised my voice just loud enough. You're not supposed to be here. We make the rules, she shot back. Or have you forgotten? That was it, wasn't it? The whole sickness of it. They truly believed that. They believed they were the architects of civilization, the custodians of order, guardians of curb appeal and good manners. But strip away the carefully manicured lawns, and they were just bullies in suits, standing on land that was never theirs to begin with. They hadn't forgotten. They'd never learned. I didn't care if they thought I was the villain. Maybe I was. But I remembered the look on the faces of the people they'd driven out before me. A single mother fined into bankruptcy because her teenage son painted his bicycle the wrong color. An old man forced to sell after his front porch, perfectly stable but slightly chipped, was deemed a safety hazard. A family that dared to grow vegetables in their front garden, harassed until they moved away in frustration. This wasn't just a party. This was a repeat of everything that had come before, dressed up in sequins and polite invitations. Another trap sprung. They'd propped a folding table next to one of my rain barrels. It collapsed under the weight of their imported snacks, sending dips and delicate hors d'oeuvres splattering into the mud. The collective gasp that followed felt rehearsed, like the sound of spoiled children dropping their birthday cake. But the cracks were forming. Their unity was starting to strain under the pressure of real discomfort. One of the younger board members, a woman with nervous eyes and hands that couldn't stop fidgeting with the edge of her phone case, looked at me, then back at the president. Doubt flickered in her face. Maybe she'd stayed silent in those HOA meetings before, letting fines pile up against neighbors because it was easier to go along with the group. Maybe this was the first time she was starting to see what they really were. That was the thing with people like them. They built their kingdoms on compliance, on quiet agreement, on everyone being too tired or too polite to fight back. But once you break that silence, once one person steps outside the lines, the whole machine starts to shake. I wasn't naive. Glitter bombs and collapsing tables weren't going to stop the HOA. They had lawyers, connections, influence. But I wasn't fighting to win in court. I was fighting to make sure they remembered this day for what it was, the day someone told them no. Don't think you're clever, the president snapped. When this is over, we'll have you fined, evicted, whatever it takes. You don't belong here. The words echoed, familiar, poisonous. I'd heard those exact same phrases aimed at others before me. It wasn't about property or bylaws. It was about control, about power, about erasing anything that didn't fit their image of perfection. I stood straighter. Maybe I don't, I said, voice steady. But neither do you. That hit harder than I expected. One of the others actually flinched at the words. And then came the next trap, not one of mine, but one of their own making. The music they'd brought, the carefully curated playlist of light jazz and soft pop, cut out. Instead, from hidden speakers I'd mounted days ago in preparation, came recordings of the HOA president herself. Not one or two. Dozens. Snippets from board meetings, voicemails, emails, all public record if you knew where to look, all neatly stitched together in a collage of casual cruelty. Eyesore on the street. Honestly, I don't even think they know how to mow a lawn properly. One by one, we'll get rid of the trash. Her voice, her words, projected loud enough to echo through the trees, carried on the wind for anyone within earshot to hear. The color drained from her face. Now the discomfort wasn't just inconvenience, it was exposure. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just stood there and let it happen. Let them hear what leadership sounded like when the microphones were supposed to be off. Let them choke on the truth. They thought they came here for a party. I came here to end theirs. The silence that followed wasn't like the quiet of nature or the peaceful hush of early morning woods. This was the sharp-edged, hollow kind of silence that falls over a room when a secret is exposed in front of those who were never supposed to hear it. The kind that hums with embarrassment, with betrayal, with fear of association. I watched them stand there, the supposed leaders of our beautiful community, dripping with glitter, flour clinging to their perfectly curated clothes, snack food smeared on polished loafers, and now surrounded by the echo of their leader's venomous words looping in crisp clarity from hidden speakers. The president tried to regain composure, but the cracks in her armor were clear. Her hands flexed and clenched at her sides like she was preparing for a fight she'd never trained for. She was the queen of bylaws and fines, of passive-aggressive newsletter comments, of fake smiles in front of new families while privately planning their exile. But here, standing exposed in my yard, the weight of her empire sagging around her, she looked small. Smaller than she'd ever allowed herself to appear. Her gaze shot toward her entourage, seeking validation, some kind of unified front, but all she found were uncomfortable faces, sidelong glances, people shuffling back away from her as though her reputation was contagious. The power dynamic was unraveling, and she knew it. The funny thing about self-appointed rulers: their authority only exists as long as people agree to pretend it does. She opened her mouth to speak, probably gearing up for some half-hearted justification, but I cut her off before she could launch into the script. "Don't bother," I said, voice even. "There's more." And there was. The recordings I'd collected didn't stop at careless insults about untidy lawns or non-standard porch paint. They didn't stop with her disdain for families who didn't fit her image. The worst ones were about the removals, the meetings behind closed doors where neighbors were stripped of their dignity one motion at a time, disguised as community improvement. "I don't care how long they've been there," one clip rang out from the speakers, her tone sharp and cruel. "They don't belong in this neighborhood. We'll fine them until they can't stand it anymore. They'll leave. They always leave." That was the real poison underneath the HOA's smiles and holiday cookouts. It was conquest dressed up in politeness. Every eviction, every forced sale, every despairing family reduced to packing boxes and whispered tears, had been planned around poolside drinks and committee meetings held in manicured backyards. Not today. The weight of the recordings finally landed fully on the crowd. Several of them stepped backward, as though sheer distance could undo their association. The younger woman I'd noticed earlier glanced at me with something almost like apology in her eyes, but I didn't want apologies. I wanted resistance. And maybe, just maybe, she was starting to find it. The president barked a laugh, brittle and humorless. "This is pathetic," she snapped, volume rising to cover her panic. "You think some edited clips and childish traps are going to stop us? This is nothing. I can have your place condemned. I can have every court in the county hounding you. You're one person. One scrubby little loner." She wanted me angry. She wanted me yelling, matching her chaos with my own so she could twist it into aggression, into threat, into something she could weaponize in the next HOA newsletter. I didn't give her that satisfaction. Instead, I let the next part of my preparation speak for itself. From behind one of the SUVs, a low, unmistakable sound rose, the hum of generators I'd rigged to power a projection unit aimed squarely at the front of my cabin. Onto the blank wooden wall splashed video after video of HOA meetings, not just her voice now, but her face, surrounded by smug nodding board members, as they openly mocked and plotted the removal of every resident who didn't meet their personal aesthetic standard. For the first time that evening, she faltered visibly. Her bluster cracked, and something desperate flickered beneath her eyes. This wasn't just embarrassment anymore. This was evidence. Evidence that could be copied, spread, sent to local news stations, posted online. This wasn't a prank war. This was exposure of systematic harassment by a body that pretended to stand for community values. She stepped forward as if to approach me, but I raised a single hand, palm outward, not in aggression, just in dismissal. "It's already out there," I said calmly. "Every email, every recording, every vote. The neighbors you pushed out deserve to know why they lost their homes." Her lips trembled, but no words came. The others, those board members who once lined up behind her, who once wore matching polos and shared poolside drinks, were already edging toward their vehicles. Not defiant. Not indignant. Just afraid. Afraid of the fallout. Afraid of what happens when the illusion breaks and you're left standing exposed in the wreckage of your own ambition. Somewhere inside, I almost pitied them. Almost. You ruined your own reputation, I added. You just needed me to hold up the mirror. The flower ghost from earlier, the man who'd tripped the fishing line, brushed past her without speaking, heading straight for his SUV. Others followed. There would be no party tonight. No forced smiles and passive-aggressive congratulations. No sparkling champagne toasts to the HOA's iron grip on the community. Just silence, engines starting, the crunch of gravel as they fled back toward the neat, paved driveways of their manicured subdivision. She remained standing in the yard, alone, glitter catching in her hair, expensive shoes caked in mud. For a second, I thought she might scream. Instead, she stood rigid, as if refusing to give me that last satisfaction. Pride was the only thing left propping her up now. I'm not done with you, she finally whispered, venom low beneath her breath. This isn't over. No, I agreed. It's just starting. But this wasn't about revenge anymore. It wasn't even about me anymore. This was about every person who'd been steamrolled by her kind. Every silent resignation, every family broken by invented regulations, every immigrant couple harassed into leaving a place they tried to call home. The recordings, the videos, they were only the beginning. This wasn't personal war. This was systemic rot being dragged into daylight for everyone to see. One by one, their cars vanished into the trees, tail lights glowing weakly as they retreated back to their glass castles. And there she stood, the queen of nothing, finally realizing that the empire she'd built on fear and silence was already crumbling under the weight of its own arrogance. I didn't say another word. I just let the forest swallow the echoes of her failure. Morning came heavy with fog, curling between the trees like cautious fingers, masking the world in soft gray. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, pine, and something sharper, change. By sunrise, news had already begun to spread. Small, at first. Local whispers, cautious texts between neighbors who had long suspected but never dared speak openly. The carefully polished image of the HOA was cracking, not from loud rebellion, but from the steady drip of undeniable truth. Power doesn't crumble all at once. It unravels thread by thread until the tapestry falls apart under its own weight. They underestimated how quickly quiet fury spreads when given proof. The recordings were already circulating through the neighborhood message boards before most of the HOA board members made it home. It wasn't me who uploaded them. I didn't have to. Someone else, someone who'd stood silent in those meetings or sat frustrated in their own home watching late fees pile up, must have taken the step. That was the thing about control. Once people taste resistance, the spell breaks fast. By noon, I saw the first signs of visible rebellion. Cars I hadn't seen in weeks slowly driving by the edge of my property, windows rolled down, occupants looking. Not hostile, not afraid, just curious. The scared ones had already driven away with the party crew last night. What was left were the hesitant ones, the maybe all this time we were wrong ones, the people who wanted to believe that order was necessary but couldn't stomach cruelty anymore. One of them stopped, a local handyman I recognized. He didn't say much. Just nodded once, respectful, like he knew the weight of what had been done. His quiet acknowledgement meant more than any apology could have. He didn't need to say the words. We both knew them already. But the HOA president? She wasn't the type to surrender. Some people mistake exposure for defeat, thinking that being caught is the same as being beaten. That's not how people like her operate. They claw for control like drowning men reaching for floating debris. Pride doesn't fade quietly. I knew she'd fight with the tools she trusted: paperwork, official letters, legal threats dressed up in bureaucratic politeness. It was only a matter of time before the first document arrived, dressed up in city letterhead or legal jargon, thinly veiled as official concern. I wasn't worried about that. Paper could be shredded. Lawyers could be answered. What mattered more was that the curtain had been pulled back, and now people could see the machinery for what it was, just a handful of petty tyrants pretending to be stewards of community values. That afternoon, I checked my mailbox. Right on cue, a letter, formal, embossed, full of phrasing like community standards violation, pending review, and further disciplinary action. It would have been funny if it weren't so predictable. The machinery of her influence, desperate to reassert itself in the form of procedure. I read every line with the same patience one uses for old recipes, tedious but familiar. This wasn't about me anymore, and that was the sharpest edge of all. She didn't realize she'd already lost the only battle that mattered, the faith of the people she claimed to represent. And once people lose faith, no amount of paperwork can build that bridge again. Later, as the sun burned away the fog and painted sharp light through the treetops, I saw the first real crack in her hold. The HOA newsletter, their smug little monthly propaganda sheet, arrived thinner than usual. The editor's note, usually signed proudly by the president herself, was instead authored by someone else. No explanation. Just a small, uncomfortable absence where authority used to stand. It was the silence that follows scandal, not yet admission, but certainly shame. And still, they thought they could manage it. That was the funniest part. They believed reputation was a faucet you could turn off and on. Say nothing, wait, let tempers cool, and people might forget. But people weren't forgetting. Families who'd lost gardens, who'd been fined for children leaving bikes on porches, who'd been hounded for fence colors and lawn decorations, they remembered. The HOA wasn't just fighting embarrassment now, they were fighting memory. Some of the board tried to distance themselves too. Social media profiles getting scrubbed, photos deleted, boards restructured. Cowards in suits, all scrambling like roaches when the lights come on. Not out of guilt, never guilt. Just fear of association. No one wanted to be tied to the voice on those recordings, the sneer in those meeting transcripts. Their little empire, so carefully curated with fake smiles and flag-waving barbecues, was hollow, and the sound of it collapsing was beautiful. That night, another car drove by slow. This time it stopped. A woman got out. She didn't approach the house, just stood at the edge of the driveway. I recognized her as one of the neighbors who'd never spoken much before, polite waves across mailboxes, brief conversations about weather, nothing deep. She stood with her arms crossed, not defensive, more like steadying herself. "I heard it," she finally said. "All of it." I nodded but said nothing. "I just want you to know," she added, swallowing, "we didn't all agree with them. Most of us just didn't know how to stop it. That was the thing that broke me a little. They didn't know how to stop it. How many of them had gone along because it was easier? Because the fight looked too big? Because they feared social exile more than they feared injustice? But it wasn't blame I felt. It was understanding. I'd been silent in other parts of my life too. I knew how easy it was to let a machine grind along unchecked because standing in front of it alone felt suicidal. "It's not over," she added. "They're gonna try to claw it back. Lawyers. Papers. Maybe worse." I met her gaze. "They can try. But they don't own the truth anymore." Her shoulders relaxed just slightly. "Good," she whispered. "Good. It wasn't victory yet. Victory doesn't come with speeches or flags. It comes slowly, in pieces, with each person who refuses to sit down again after standing up once." As the days stretched on, things began to shift. Meetings that were once closed suddenly became public. Emails that had been tightly controlled were now circulating through residents who used to sit quietly with their hands folded. Families that had kept their gardens hidden behind tall hedges started trimming them proudly. Porch swings went up. Bright paint appeared on window frames that had once been threatened with fines. Color was returning to a neighborhood that had been strangled by conformity. The HOA wasn't gone. But it wasn't the monster it used to be either. The president, former president now, fought her legal battles, sent her threats, tried to rally her shrinking circle of loyalists, but it was like shouting into a storm. No one was listening anymore. Respect is currency, and hers was worthless. I wasn't a hero. I never wanted to be one. Heroes are for movies. What I was, what I had to be, was simply finished with being afraid of paper kings. And in the soft, rising hum of change, I knew one thing clearly: you don't need to burn down kingdoms to end them. You just need to stop believing in them. The weeks that followed didn't bring explosions or headline-grabbing arrests. That's not how these kinds of battles play out. They unfold slowly, one meeting at a time, one uncomfortable silence giving way to a whispered agreement, until the fabric of control frays so much it can't hold together anymore. And that was exactly what was happening. Little by little, the empire of petty fines and fake smiles was collapsing under its own weight, and no glossy newsletter or special meeting could patch it back together. The president, now more a shadow of her former self than any kind of leader, tried to claw her way back into relevance. New memos appeared, badly written, filled with desperate language about preserving the dignity of the community and fighting misinformation. But when the same people she'd threatened with fines were now openly discussing her betrayals at backyard barbecues, there wasn't much dignity left to preserve. Her name used to command quiet respect, or at least anxious obedience. Now it was a punchline at best, a warning at worst. Even her closest allies had begun rewriting their loyalties, pretending they'd never been involved. What she didn't realize, what most people like her never realize, is that fear doesn't last forever. Fear works until someone stands up. And then, once that first voice speaks out, others find their own. What starts as one quiet refusal builds until it's undeniable. More neighbors began to drift by the cabin now, not out of curiosity, but out of solidarity. They weren't looking for a leader. They were looking for permission to stop pretending everything was fine. I gave them that without speeches or grand gestures. Just by standing my ground, by refusing to bend to the cheap power plays and the paperwork threats, I gave them an example of what resistance looked like. Nothing dramatic. Just stubborn. Just steady. One afternoon, an elderly couple from the far end of the community walked all the way up my drive. The husband's gait was slow, careful, worn down by time and disappointment. His wife clutched his elbow, steadying him, but her posture was straighter, sharper, like she was carrying both their weight that day. When they reached me, she didn't ask permission. She simply stood tall, looked me in the eye, and said, "About time someone stood up to her." They didn't stay long. Just that one sentence, that one nod of acknowledgement, and then they made their slow walk back home. That's how change happens. Not with roaring crowds, but with quiet affirmations from people who've had enough of pretending they don't notice the cracks forming in their own walls. It wasn't long before I heard the next desperate play from the former HOA board. A letter circulated, unsigned of course, though everyone knew exactly whose hand had written it, accusing me of being a disruptive element, of threatening the cohesion of the neighborhood. It was laughable, really, considering that cohesion had been built on forced compliance and whispered threat. Now that people were talking openly, gathering without permission, painting their fences whatever color they liked, suddenly I was the threat. I kept that letter. I pinned it to my wall, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of how scared power becomes when it loses its grip. One evening as the sun fell in gold slants through the trees, I watched the first official signs of the board's collapse. A notice went up on the community bulletin, not from the HOA, but from a group of residents who'd decided they'd had enough. They were organizing a vote, not sanctioned by the old leadership, but by the community itself. They wanted to dissolve the current HOA entirely, replace it with something transparent, accountable, something actually built for the benefit of the people who lived here, not just a club for social climbers in khakis and polo shirt. I didn't organize it. I didn't need to. They had found their own way now, and that's the way it should be. Real community isn't about one loud voice dragging everyone forward. It's about dozens of people, maybe hundreds, deciding together that enough is enough. The meeting for the vote was set for the following week. The excitement wasn't loud, but it was steady, a hum of quiet conversations at mailbox clusters, a few firm handshakes exchanged over garden fences. The former president didn't show her face much after that. Word was, she'd been consulting with lawyers, calling in favors from old real estate friends, anything to salvage what was left of her influence. But the thing about influence is that it can't be reclaimed by force once it's been exposed as a lie. You can't shame people back into silence after they've started speaking the truth. When the day of the vote arrived, it wasn't a dramatic showdown. There were no security guards, no shouting matches, just folding chairs arranged in a loose circle at the community park, the kind of quiet rebellion that looks so ordinary from the outside but feels like a revolution to the people inside it. No one wore suits. No one brought champagne. They brought homemade lemonade, cookies, children with scuffed knees, dogs on leashes, folding chairs from garages, and for the first time in years, they brought honesty. The vote wasn't unanimous, but it didn't need to be. Enough hands went up to change the tide. The HOA wasn't dead yet, but its reign was. The members of the board who hadn't already resigned were given clear ultimatums: step down gracefully or be removed. Some fought it, tried to pull rank, but no one was listening anymore. The only thing worse than being despised is being irrelevant. I sat off to the side, not needing to be in the center of it. This wasn't about me. It was about them realizing they'd had the power all along. As the sun set behind the trees, I thought about everything it took to get here. All the planning, the hours listening to smug voices over recorded meetings, the quiet fury of watching good people get pushed around because someone liked playing king. And in the end, it didn't take rage to tear it down. It took exposure. It took steady resistance. And most of all, it took neighbors deciding they didn't want to live small anymore. I wasn't special. I didn't have wealth or titles or some secret weapon of influence. I just had refusal. And that's all it ever takes to break the grip of a tyrant, one steady, relentless refusal to kneel. The former president's house went up for sale a few months later. No one celebrated. No one threw a party. People just kept mowing their lawns, tending their gardens, waving to each other across fences, not because they were required to, but because it felt right. That's the thing about real communities. They don't need rules to be decent to each other. They just need room to breathe. And I was finally breathing easy again. It was strange how quickly peace felt normal again. After years of quietly bracing for conflict with every trip to the mailbox, every knock on the door, I almost didn't recognize the feeling of simply existing without a weight on my shoulders. There were no more sudden fines for invented violations, no more condescending HOA letters hidden behind phrases like, as a courtesy or as a reminder. For the first time since I'd moved into this place, the land around my cabin felt entirely mine, not in the legal sense, but in the way that matters more. Mine because no one else could take it from me through threats or manipulation. Mine because I had fought for the right to be left alone and won. The remnants of the old HOA didn't completely disappear, at least not right away. A few of the true believers still clung to the old system, still whispered behind curtains, still wore the smug expressions of people who believed they were protecting something important. But even they couldn't muster the same energy anymore. Their power wasn't real. It had only ever existed because others allowed it. Now, with that permission revoked, they were just neighbors with bad opinions, and bad opinions don't carry weight when no one listens. The new committee that had formed was different. It wasn't perfect. Nothing built by people ever is, but it was honest. Meetings were open. Budgets were published. Rules were rewritten, simplified, made with input instead of decrees. People could argue without fearing retaliation. It felt less like governance and more like cooperation, the way neighborhoods should be before someone gets the bright idea that titles matter more than trust. I watched it all with a kind of detached satisfaction. I didn't need to be part of the meetings, didn't need to raise my hand or sign my name to anything. My job was done before the first vote was ever cast. I had been the rock they tried to move, and when they couldn't, the rest of the mountain shifted behind me. Sometimes that's all it takes to change the course of a place. Not leadership, just resistance. What surprised me most wasn't how people treated me afterward, but how they treated each other. It wasn't like we'd suddenly become best friends or started hosting block parties every weekend. But there was something different in the air now. People waved more often. Not out of forced politeness, but because the barriers of suspicion were gone. Conversations that used to be clipped, cautious, were now genuine. It wasn't community service weekends or banners proclaiming unity. It was smaller, better. It was two neighbors helping carry lumber for a deck project. It was shared coffee on porches that used to be battlegrounds for HOA citations. It was quiet apologies that didn't need grandstanding. One morning, I got a letter in the mail again, but this one wasn't from a lawyer or a board member. It was handwritten, carefully, like someone hadn't written anything by hand in years. No return address, just a folded note. "Thank you," it said. No signature. Just those two words, clean and true. That note meant more to me than any victory speech ever could. It told me what I'd hoped was true but dared not believe. People had noticed, and even if they hadn't stood beside me in the beginning, they were here now. I didn't need credit. I just needed to know that silence had finally been broken. As for the former president, her house sold faster than I expected. People have short memories when a good real estate deal is involved. No one talked much about her after she left. There were rumors. She'd moved out of state, tried to start fresh somewhere new, somewhere her reputation hadn't followed her yet. Maybe she'd find another neighborhood to manage, another group of people to manipulate, or maybe she'd finally learn something about humility. Either way, she was no longer my concern. What mattered was that she wasn't here, wasn't standing on porches demanding compliance with rules no one had agreed to, wasn't hiding threats behind smiles anymore. What surprised me most about the aftermath was how unremarkable it all seemed. After fighting for so long, after setting the traps, exposing the lies, standing alone while the threats stacked up, I expected the victory to feel louder. But it didn't. It felt like a deep breath after holding it too long. It felt like walking barefoot on grass after a long winter. Not triumphant, not wild, just right. Just earned. And that was enough for me. The cabin itself, once a point of tension and accusation, became something else too, not a symbol of rebellion anymore, but of stability. Where they once saw defiance, they now saw endurance. Where they once tried to turn it into a problem, it became part of the solution. Neighbors started asking questions. Not about violations or bylaws, but about the construction, the repairs I'd made myself, the tricks I'd used to keep pests out, how I'd rigged my own rain-catch system. For years, this house had been a fortress. Now it was a home. It was part of the neighborhood not because I'd asked for approval, but because I'd stopped asking altogether and built a life on my own terms. I caught myself smiling more often. Not the forced, polite smile I used to give at HOA events to avoid confrontation, but a real one. The kind that creeps up on you before you realize it's there. Sometimes it was at nothing in particular. Just the sound of birds returning, or the crunch of gravel under boots, or the sight of kids riding bikes without parents barking at them about safety violations. A few people even came to ask how I'd done it. Not the traps, not the confrontation, but how I'd stood up in the first place. I never gave them a grand explanation. I told them the truth, the quiet, boring truth they didn't want to hear. I just got tired of being pushed around. That's all it takes. Not heroism. Not brilliance. Just being tired enough to stop letting it happen. If there was one thing I wanted them to remember from all of this, it was that no one hands you freedom. You take it by refusing to let anyone convince you you don't deserve it. And when you stop asking for permission to live your life, you find that the people who tried to control you suddenly look very small. The community didn't need saving. It needed waking up. And now that they were awake, I hoped they wouldn't forget again. People shouldn't need reminders of their own strength, But life has a way of making folks comfortable in cages they don't see until someone rattles the bars. I wasn't that someone anymore. My part was done. The rest was up to them. And for the first time since I moved here, I actually trusted them to handle it. Peace doesn't always come with banners and celebrations. Sometimes it's just the absence of threats, the quiet understanding between neighbors that no one's coming with a clipboard to ruin your Sunday anymore. That was enough for me. Finally, after everything, it was enough. What stayed with me the most wasn't the battles or the victories, but the way the smallest changes became the loudest proof that everything had been worth it. It wasn't about taking down someone corrupt or exposing lies. It was about reclaiming the ordinary, taking back the everyday moments that had been stolen by control disguised as order. For too long, the HOA used bureaucracy like a weapon, dressing up selfishness as responsibility, wrapping greed in phrases like community standards. But now, those words didn't scare anyone anymore. They were just noise. And behind that noise was something much stronger. Normal life, unpolished, imperfect, but finally free of someone else's permission. The cabin, once framed by the board as an eyesore or a problem to be dealt with, had become something else entirely. Now it was an anchor point, not because it was grand or beautiful, but because it represented the one thing no HOA can regulate: integrity. People didn't come to admire it. They came because it was proof that you don't have to be impressive to be untouchable. You just have to refuse to lose yourself. The place looked the same as it always had, wood weathered by seasons, windows a little off-center, a door with creaks that no amount of oil could fix. But now, it felt untouchable because no one else had a claim to it anymore except me. The thing I realized, standing in that truth, was that real power isn't loud. It's not in memos or votes or legal jargon. Real power is in not needing anyone's approval to wake up in the morning and live exactly the way you choose. I didn't need validation from a boardroom or signatures on a dotted line. What I needed was what I already had: my land, my work, my peace. The funniest part was how ordinary the world looked while everything changed beneath it. Birds still sang at dawn. Grass still pushed up stubbornly through gravel no matter how often you tried to tamp it down. People still argued over fence heights or whether or not someone's dog barked too much, but those arguments weren't poisoned by fear anymore. They were just disagreements. The kind that happen in every real community, the kind that resolve with compromise or grumbling and then a neighbor bringing over tomatoes from their garden later that week as an unspoken truce. One afternoon, I noticed something strange but telling. The official HOA sign, the one mounted near the front entrance of the neighborhood, crisp blue with white lettering, was gone. No ceremony. No announcement. Just gone. Whether someone had removed it or whether it had been taken down as part of the new vote, no one said. But its absence spoke louder than any meeting minutes or newsletters ever could. That sign had once stood like a badge of control, a constant reminder that someone else always had a say over your home, your yard, your choices. Now it was just an empty post, splintered at the edges, weathered by rain and sun. Funny how something can vanish like that, leaving nothing but the memory of what it used to demand from you. That was when it hit me fully, not just intellectually, but in the gut, that I didn't owe anyone anything anymore. Not explanations. Not apologies. Not participation in games built by people who thought their clipboards made them important. I didn't owe anyone silence in the face of bullying, and I didn't owe anyone compliance with rules they wrote just to make themselves feel significant. And standing in that truth felt better than any speech I could have given or any confrontation I could have won. Even better was seeing how the others around me started carrying themselves differently too. Shoulders that had been hunched with quiet defeat were starting to lift. Conversations that used to be guarded became more open. It wasn't a revolution of banners and slogans. It was a revolution of posture, of people realizing they didn't have to live small lives just because someone else told them to. I started noticing projects cropping up all over the neighborhood. Not hidden, not permitted by forms submitted in triplicate, but simply done. Someone built a shed. Someone else finally put up the garden arch they'd been talking about for years. Another family repainted their siding in a color that, by old HOA standards, would have drawn an immediate citation. But now? Now it was just color. Now it was just people living. The fear of the letter in the mailbox was gone, replaced by the simple, stubborn act of existence. And when you've been denied that for long enough, you don't take it for granted once you get it back. I watch these things not like a leader giving approval, but like a neighbor witnessing others finally remember they don't need permission to be whole. The old routines were replaced by better ones. Instead of secret board meetings deciding people's lives in hushed tones, there were casual gatherings at the community park, open to anyone who wanted to show up. Instead of fines, there were favors. Instead of threats, there were thank yous. It wasn't utopia. People still disagreed. They still had bad days. But the difference was clear. No one was using rules as weapons anymore. One of the last signs of the old order disappearing came when someone finally replaced that broken HOA signpost, not with a new set of regulations, but with a handmade wooden plank that simply read, "Welcome home." No names, no titles, no declarations of authority. Just a greeting. Honest. Open. And that was all it needed to be. I stood under that sign for a long while after it went up, just letting the words sink in. Not because I needed to feel like I'd won something, but because it reminded me that this is what all of it had been about, not rebellion, not revenge, just belonging. Just home. No one thanked me in speeches. No one handed me awards. What I got instead was something better. The quiet nods of people who used to keep their heads down, now walking a little taller. The sound of kids laughing on bikes that didn't have to stay on invisible paths anymore. The slow but steady heartbeat of a neighborhood remembering that the best communities aren't built by power. They're built by people refusing to be small. That's what I'd fought for, even if I didn't realize it at the start. Not for control, but for the right to not be controlled. For the right of everyone here to argue about gardens and fences and colors because they wanted to, not because they were afraid of the next letter in the mail. For the right to disagree without it costing them peace of mind. It didn't end with fireworks. It didn't need to. It ended the way real victories always do, not with noise but with calm. With the kind of quiet that tells you no one's watching over your shoulder anymore, waiting to punish you for living your own life. That's what home is supposed to be. And finally, that's what it was.